All right, as you're being seated, if you will, get your Bibles out and turn to Numbers chapter 13. And today's going to be a little bit different. Normally, I ask you to help me to greet the Lakeside campus, but today I need you to help me greet the 11 o'clock downtown campus. Because of Windshape Camp and some things going on the stage, I'll be at the Lakeside campus at 11 o'clock, preaching live there today. So help me in welcoming those at the 11 o'clock service downtown. We also want to welcome and greet all of those who are watching online. Happy you're with us today. And it is good to be back. I've been out 3 weeks. Last night I shaved the beard off. And when I came back, I kind of rewrote my message. When I left, I had it in the tank, ready to go. Came back and I rewrote it. Even though we're in the Hero series, we're kind of going to adjust the message today. And here's why. 3 weeks ago, I left to go on vacation, and I tell you, it seemed like the world fell apart. If you can just think of the headlines in the last 3 weeks. Not long after I left, a crazy guy gets in a truck in Nice, France, and plows down 80 people, including a lot of children. A guy in Germany goes on Facebook, invites people to McDonald's for a special, deal at McDonald's and kills 7 who show up there, or killed 9 there and wounded so many others. There was the attempted coup in Turkey, which, because it didn't happen, has long-term implications on that nation. And the suicide bomber in Afghanistan walked into a crowd, blew up 80 people. The priest that was killed in his own church. And you're looking at all those headlines, and you're thinking, man, these are headlines that should dominate a year. And these things happened within 3 weeks. And then what was going on here in our nation, not long after I left, is when the Dallas shootings happened, and 5 police officers there killed, others wounded. The 3 in Baton Rouge who were killed, one of those officers is still on life support who was shot there. Nightclub shooting in Fort Myers that 2 children were killed, and all the others, 17 others who were shot. The police killing in San Diego. And then there are so many things in our country that don't even make the headlines. In fact, this year, so far, through the end of July, 380 homicides in Chicago. Last year, I think it was 490 total. And we're just barely a little over halfway through the year, and they've almost reached that number. And when we look at all of the things that are going on in our culture today and in our nation today, I have to ask the question, are we entering into a time where God has taken his protection off of our nation? Maybe this isn't just a weird news cycle over the last 3 weeks. Maybe it's a new reality. Maybe we've entered into a new time as a nation. And so as I've been looking and thinking and praying over all those things, I decided to adjust my message today. And so I've got a lot of notes. I've changed a lot of things, and hopefully we can get through it in time. But when I looked at all of the things that are dominating the headlines today, and especially in our nation, I thought about this. Should we be surprised? I mean, as a nation, for how many years now have we basically told God we don't want his way? As a nation, we've basically said we want to do things our way, kick them out of school, kick them out, and you know the whole deal. And when we do that, should we be surprised that evil dominates the headlines? And so what I want us to do, we were going to look at Moses today. We're still going to look at Moses, but I want us to focus on the Israelites and their wilderness wanderings. Because of their disobedience as a nation, what should have been a short trip into the promised land ended up being a 40-year journey through the desert. And ask ourselves this question, are we as a nation, have we entered into kind of a time of desert wilderness wandering? Are we seeing the results of telling God no long enough and doing things our way? And are we living in a new reality? So we pick up Moses has led the children of Israel out of Egypt. Their next destination is the Promised Land. They're going to take about a 1-year journey to get to the edge of the Promised Land. But because of the disobedience of the Israelites and because of a lack of leadership on Moses' part, what should have been a 1-year trip into the Promised Land ended up being a 40-year journey in the wilderness. Top of your notes, I put 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6. And look what it says. It says, Paul is saying, now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Who are the they there? What Paul is talking about, he's talking about the Israelites and the time from leaving Egypt until the time they got to the border of the Promised Land. Saying in that year, they focused their hearts on evil over and over and over again. And because of that, that led to the wilderness wanderings. And what Paul is basically telling us here in 1 Corinthians, we need to learn from their mistakes and not make the same mistakes. Now, as a nation, it may be too late. We may already be into that. But as individuals, we can learn a lot from what happens here. In your notes, let's define wilderness wandering. Wilderness wandering is when the consequences of sin impact a huge area of my life for a significant length of time. I would say 40 years in the desert is a significant length of time. And so now notice what I didn't say. I didn't say when the consequences of your sin. I just said when the consequences of sin, and we're going to see why that's important in just a few minutes. Let's pick up the story in Numbers chapter 13. The Israelites have spent a year getting to the edge of the Promised Land. They've received the 10 Commandments, the whole manna and quail and so many things, the water from the rock and the water that was sour is now pure and all of those things. And now they're at the edge of the Promised Land. And look at verse 1 and 2 of chapter 13. The Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. Don't miss the last part of that. Send some men into Canaan to explore it because I'm about to give it to them. And so God went ahead and told Moses, take one from each tribe and let them go in and explore the land. And so they went in for 40 days. They explored the land. They came out. They all gathered and they gave their report. And the 12 came out and they gave their report, and here's what they said. They said it is exactly what God said it was. Man, it is a land flowing with milk and honey. It is fertile. It's amazing the fruit that's there and the food that's there and how lush this place is. But then 10 of them said, and even though it's everything God said it was, they said, but we can't go in because the enemy is pretty big. And there's no way we can take them. Let me just say this. We usually get in trouble when the but gets involved. All right? I'm just telling you. We usually get in trouble when the but gets involved. And here's what I mean. They said, yeah, it's everything God said it is, but there's an enemy there. We can't go in. And here's how we usually say that. God, I know what your word says, but this is kind of a unique case. God, I know what you desire, but it's just this once. But God, they did it first. But God, you just don't understand. Or, but God, I just couldn't help myself. Or but I can't do that. Or, but God, that's not politically correct. And we can go on. And it's usually when we get in trouble is when we say, yes, God, but. And that's what 10 of the spies said. They said the land's exactly what God says, but we can't go in. These people are too big and we can't take them and they'll kill us. 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, said, we can do it. In fact, if you go to chapter 14, verse 8, they even said, God will give it to us. And remember what God told Moses, go into the land of which I am about to give to you. Now, when I left, I was going to talk about Moses being a hero, but let me just say this about Moses here. Right here, Moses' leadership is a failure. Moses was to lead the people into the Promised Land, and Moses is silent. And the lesson for us to learn in that is this. Whenever we know truth and we remain silent, there are always consequences. And Moses was supposed to be the one speaking up. In fact, Joshua and Caleb are doing Moses' job for him. But they didn't have the positional authority to make things happen. They're saying, we can do it. God's going to give it to us. We need to go into the land. And Moses is silent. And because of that, there are some incredible repercussions to that. You see, the people listened to the majority report, and because of that, they weren't going to go into the promised land. Let me say this. The majority report, especially when you talk about spiritual matters, it's rarely the right report. And so the people decide what they're going to do is they're going to go back to Egypt. They're going to kill Moses, and they're going to kill Aaron, and they're going to get a new leader and let that leader bring them back into Egypt. Now remember, these are the people who'd seen God move in some miraculous ways. But they saw the enemy, and they kowtowed in fear and said they weren't going to go in. Their faith was so weak, they turned their backs on God and rebelled. And guess what? God is not too happy with it. So God's about to wipe them out. He's saying, listen, enough's enough, and he's going to wipe them out. And now Moses actually steps up to the plate and shows some leadership. And Moses stands in the gap, and he cries out to God, and he prays for the people. And he said, God, if you kill them here in the desert, imagine what your reputation is going to be among all the other nations. So God, you need to preserve them. And then look at verse 18. As he's praying to God, look at what he says in verse 18. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children of the sins for the sins of their fathers to the third and fourth generation. Think about this. He's praying to God, interceding for the people, and then it's like he says, oh, by the way, Lord, remember you are you're patient, and you're slow to anger and abounding in love. Look, at this point, he's not reminding God of who God is. He's saying this for the benefit of the people. He's letting the people know you're in the mess you're in now because of your rebellion. We serve a God who is slow to anger, who's abounding in love and forgiving of sin and rebellion. But understand this, sin cannot go unpunished, and it affects not just us, but the next generations that follow. In fact, if you go over to verse 22 of chapter 14, it goes on to say that the sins of the Israelites was a habitual sin. He said, for 10 times, God said, you have tested me. Now, whether that's 10 literal times, because we can definitely go through that year of wilderness wandering and find more than 10 times that they rebelled against God, or if it's just God saying, look, there has been this habitual habit of you turning your backs and sinning against me. Either way, God says, enough is enough, and now my discipline is going to come. And because of that, for 40 years, they're going to wander in the desert until everyone 20 years old or older has died, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. That includes Moses and Aaron. But Joshua and Caleb are going to make it because they trusted God at the edge of the promised land. So I want us to look at this issue of wilderness wandering for just a minute, and let's hope it can teach us some lessons that can both give us peace and courage in the wilderness, but also show us some ways maybe to avoid the wilderness in our lives personally. In your notes, the wilderness can come in two forms. Number one, it can come in the form of God withdrawing his protection. And you have to wonder if that may be a little of what's going on in our nation today. Has God pulled back his blessing? Has he pulled back his protection a little bit because of the sins of the nation? That's something I'll let you figure out. But sometimes the wilderness comes with God pulling back his protection. Sometimes it comes in the form of his discipline. Now understand, God disciplines those that he loves, and his discipline is always with the motive of love, and it's to get us back in line to obedience with him. So let's have some lessons, some tips for survival in the wilderness. The first is this: don't always assume that the wilderness is God's discipline. Whenever you're going through a tough season in your life, maybe something happens that's unexplainable. Maybe you don't know why what's going on is going on, and it's devastating, and you're carrying a heavy load. Don't always assume that that's God's discipline. In your notes, a couple of things. Sometimes a wilderness is for our protection. Sometimes God brings the wilderness for our protection. Here's what we know. The route from Egypt to the promised land is not the route the Israelites took. They went all over the place before they got into the promised land. What should have been a short trip was a one-year journey, and the Bible tells us why, and you can read about it there in Exodus 13. And the reason why is because there were nations that were strong, and the Israelites were not warriors. And so instead of God bringing them through and them having a military conflict where they could have gotten routed, or maybe they would have gotten just so discouraged they would have turned back, God brought them around the trouble. So sometimes that wilderness in our lives is actually God's sovereign protection in our lives. So you're dating somebody and you think this is the one, right? This is going to be the one for a lifetime. And you wake up one day, you get a phone call, or you're out and you have a meeting, and that person says, I no longer want to go out with you, and no longer want to see you. And you're saying, God, why in the world did you let that happen? And it feels like a wilderness. No, it may be that God knew that guy was going to be a jerk and never have a job, and he was protecting you, okay? And it's hard to see in the midst of it. In the midst of it, it's hard to understand and see, but it may be God's protection. It may be, God, why didn't you give me that job? You know how much I need a job. And God, I felt like I was the most qualified. God, why did that not happen? And maybe that because God knew that something better was coming up next week, or maybe what that job would have done to you. Sometimes what feels like a wilderness really is God's protection in our lives. Secondly, sometimes what feels like a wilderness is really God's preparation in our lives. So what God does lead them to is he brings them to this place where they find themselves with the Red Sea in front of them, mountains on both sides of them, and the Egyptian army behind them. And they're freaking out because the Egyptian army is coming on them, and yet God led them there, and they got to question, why in the world would God lead them there? Well, two reasons why God led them there. Number one, God wanted to show them how big of a God he was. And secondly, he wanted to get rid of the enemy so they wouldn't be running from the army all the time. And so what happens, you know the story, he parted the Red Sea. They went through on dry land. And the Israelites got to see that they serve a God who controls nature, a God who can take a sea and divide it and provide dry land to walk across. And then when the Egyptian army came in and the waters came down on the Egyptian army, they were no longer going to be following the Israelites, that the Israelites didn't have to worry about the enemy anymore. Sometimes what feels like wilderness is really God's protection, but then sometimes it is his discipline on our lives. The second thing we need to understand, the wilderness journey might not be your fault. You might be in the wilderness, but it's not necessarily your fault. Look at what God told them. Said, none of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hands to make your home except Caleb and Joshua, the two spies who trusted him. They were the only two over 20 years old who entered into the promised land. So let me ask you this. For Joshua and Caleb, they trusted God fully through the whole process, but how long did it take them to get into the promised land? 40 years. They had to go through the wilderness wanderings, not because of their sin, but because of the sin of somebody else. All of those who are 20 years old and younger, how long did they have to wander in the wilderness? 40 years. Not because of their sin, but because of the sin of others. Sometimes we get caught in the backwash of other people's sin. As America, if we are in a wilderness wandering, understand this, that it's because of the sins of a nation, but we have people in this nation who love God deeply and serve him passionately, but it doesn't mean that we're immune to what we're going through as a nation. The third truth to understand is this: the wilderness is usually God's last resort. Let's go back to what Moses said. Lord, you are slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. You know, we have a filter that we use that builds the image of God in our head. And for some of us, God is a grandfatherly type, and his job is to protect us and to keep us out of all trouble and to give us everything we want. I mean, just be honest. That's the view some people have of God. For others, God is this cosmic killjoy just waiting for us to mess up so he can zap us and punish us, because God loves you and he's happiest most when he's punishing it. And maybe that's your filter. And those are the two extremes. But here's what we need to know. Here's what Moses said. Say, God, you're a loving God and you are slow to anger. You're abounding in love and forgiving sin and rebellion. In fact, he's what the King James Version says. God, you are long-suffering. We need to understand when God brings his discipline, it's never the first option. It's the last option. We talked about the fact that God had said, look, 10 times you rebelled against me. You know, when I was giving Moses the 10 Commandments, you're down there building a golden calf and having an orgy. 10 times. You didn't trust me when it came to the water and the food, and you belly ached about it. 10 times you didn't trust me. It wasn't my first option. Man, every time I forgave and continued to provide and continued to lead, but enough is enough. There comes a point where God says enough, and he brings his discipline. And then lastly, even in the wilderness, God provides and protects. Deuteronomy 2, verse 7. This is Moses' farewell speech to the Israelites. And he knows that he's about to go to heaven. And so he tells them, he says, the Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. The Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He's talking about during the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. He says, during those years, the Lord your God has blessed you. He has watched over your journey through the vast desert. These 40 years, the Lord your God has been with you, and you have not lacked anything. Here's what Moses just said. During the 40 years, you were blessed and you were protected. As he gives a speech, what he's saying is, he's saying, man, it wasn't God's best, but because you were obedient, God took care of you in the wilderness. He goes on to tell them and to remind them that during those 40 years, your shoes didn't wear out. Can you imagine wearing the same pair of shoes for 40 years? I go through 4 pair a year, right, at least. And he said, for 40 years, your shoes didn't wear out. For 40 years, your clothes didn't wear out. For 40 years, a couple million people living in the desert in these conditions, and there were no sicknesses or plagues that wiped out great numbers of people. God's protection was on them, even in the wilderness. And my encouragement to you is, if you find yourself in your personal wilderness, if you will walk with the Lord and trust him, you will be protected and blessed even in the wilderness. As a nation, if we as his children will seek him first and live for him, we can know his blessings and his protection even in the wilderness. So what's the takeaway? The takeaway is obedience. What God desires is obedience up front. And it's when we obey up front that God provides and he protects. It's in that obedience that we know God's pleasure. Yes, God protected and blessed in the 40 years of wandering. But let's be honest. God's desire was not 40 years in a desert, but those 40 years to be in a land flowing with milk and honey. And they didn't know God's best because they kept saying no and rebelling against God at least 10 times. And so we need to understand that God desires our obedience. personally for us to know his word and to follow his word and to enjoy his blessings. And when we find ourselves in the wilderness, to know that even there, God will provide and protect, and we still draw close to him. The key is obedience. I thought about this as I came back. I said, in many ways, I feel like our nation is going through much of what we went through in the 60s. And not many people in this room can remember that, but it was some tumultuous years in the 60s with Vietnam and with the Black Panther Party and the Democratic National Convention. And boy, you could just go on and on about the events of the 60s. But I was reminded by Troy, but the 60s brought about the 70s, and the 70s brought about the Jesus movement that really turned this country back to God. As a nation, we may be in the wilderness, but our prayer is that by God's people seeking him first, living for him, speaking up when we need to in an appropriate way, letting our light shine, that we can be those who God can use to bring another spiritual awakening to our nation. Let's pray as Troy comes and leads us in our prayer time.